Today we're going to be talking about personal identity. In particular, we're going to be talking about the theories of Aristotle and John Locke, two of the most famous classic empiricists. Let's start with the view of Locke and the general sort of problem, because he's really the one who, more than anyone else in the history of philosophy, has identified this as a distinct problem. The difficulty really is understanding what it is, not just to be a human being, or to be a bird, or to be a car, or anything like that, but what it is to be the same human being, the same car, the same bird. We could think in terms of mass terms, like water, for example, or sand, where it's not really a question of, is this the same water, is this the same sand? It could be, of course, in a particular context, but ordinarily it's just a question of more water. We don't think of water as being divided up into natural units, or sand divided up into natural units, in the way that we think of birds, or human beings, or automobiles, as divided up into natural units. So, the question of whether we have water is really just a question of distinguishing water from non-water. But it's a different thing with a natural kind term like human being, or a term like car. We not only have to tell cars from non-cars, we have to tell when something is the same car. And the same thing is true of human beings. It's not enough to know how to divide human beings from non-human beings. It's a question of what makes a given human being the same human being. What is it that really makes me me? What is it that makes me have a distinct and continuous identity across time? That's the question that Locke focuses on, and it's the question we'll be talking about today. He has a distinct view. The self, he says, is unified by consciousness. His view is deeply shaped by Descartes and his new way of ideas. Descartes' a rationalist, Locke is an empiricist. That might make it sound as if they're really in opposition, but in this case, they're not really. They're in a sense playing on the same side. They both think of consciousness as defining what it is to be me. Remember Descartes and the I think. The idea really is that I am a thing that thinks. I am essentially a thing that thinks. I know my own mind more securely than I know anything else. Locke thinks that's exactly right. I am a human being. I'm a thinking thing. I know my own mind more distinctly than I know anything else. And what makes me me is something mental, something that has to do with consciousness, with myself as a thinking being. Let's talk about that question of what makes me me. Think about me, Dan Bonneback, at different stages of my life. You might see me as a baby, wearing a Davy Crockett coonskin cap. You might see me in my junior high school ID picture. You might see me at my college graduation as I was taking my graduation picture. You could see me visiting South Fork Ranch when I first moved to Texas. Or me looking rather ridiculous as I went to a Carolina Panthers game with my brother. Or me teaching in a classroom at the University of Pittsburgh. Or you could be viewing me now. What makes me the same person throughout all those changes? Notice my height has changed, my bodily form has changed, lots and lots of things have changed about me. Nevertheless, I am the same person. How is that possible? And what is it that ties those various stages of Dan Bonneback together to make me one person? Well, that's the question that Locke addresses. And it's really part of a more general question about identity. What makes something in general the same blah, blah, blah? What makes a certain pile of sand the same pile of sand? What makes a glass of water the same glass of water? Or a bird the same bird? A car the same car? And so on. So let's think about this in a more general way. What is it that in general constitutes the identity of objects across time? Aristotle gives us one way of thinking about this. That is to say, we can't really think in terms of identity of properties. We'd like to say that, well, two things are identical if they share all the same properties. But we've already noticed that when things change, that generates a puzzle. It looks as if we've got something with one set of properties now and a different set of properties later. Me as a young man, for example, and then me as an older man. We share many properties, but we also differ in many properties. And so it looks as if we really count as different things. Now remember, Parmenides said, since no thing can have contrary properties, that shows that change is unreal. Heraclitus went in the opposite direction. He said whenever there's a change of properties, there must be a change of object. And so actually what's going on here is that we just have different time slices. There is nothing that constitutes my unity across time. I'm just a series of different objects. Well, Aristotle says the defining criterion of substance, or at least one of the defining criteria of substance, is that substances can admit contrary properties at different times. So a substance is precisely the kind of thing that can have one property at this time, a different contrary property another time, and still remain the same substance. But how is it possible? Well, in the end, Aristotle's answer is one we've already looked at, though not exactly thinking of it in this way. Aristotle says there is a set of properties that are essential to me. Now, some of them might be essential to me qua human being, but others might be essential to me specifically. They are the properties that remain constant. So the accidental properties can change. My height can change, my weight can change, the color of the shirt I'm wearing can change, and so on. All of those kinds of properties can shift across time. They're accidental properties. I can remain the same object while those properties change. But there might be some properties that are essential to me. And so the thought is, those properties are necessary to me. Those are the ones that I can't lose without becoming a different object. So here's one way of understanding what all those stages of Dan Bonnevach have in common. They share the essence of Dan Bonnevach, whatever that is. There's some set of properties that are really essential to being me. And as long as those properties don't change, the substance retains identity across time. I can remain the same person, even though lots of the accidental properties change. If you think about Aristotle's answer, you can realize fairly quickly that it's not as radical a departure from the model that Heraclitus and Parmenides were using. The idea is that there must be some set of properties that matter, and those properties don't change. There can be other properties that do change. So the accidental ones, yes, they can come and they can go. I remain the same substance. But I have an essence, and those essential properties can't change. Locke thinks this is the wrong way of thinking about things. He adopts a theory of relative identity. He says, what in general makes something the same F, the same pile of sand, or the same car, the same bird, the same human being? And he ends up saying, it depends what that property F is, that kind. In other words, the answer we'll get for what makes something that same pile of sand is not necessarily the answer we get when we consider what makes someone the same human being, or even the same person. Locke thinks those are distinct questions. So let's start with just lumps of matter, things like piles of sand. What makes one pile of sand the same as another pile of sand? Now, as soon as I say another, it sounds as if I'm contradicting myself. If it's the same pile, it's not another pile, it's that very same pile. But imagine that I see a sand pile today, and then I go back and I see one on the same spot the next day. Is it the same sand pile or not the same sand pile? How would I tell? And since we're not really focusing on the epistemological question, what does that tell us about what really constitutes the sameness of the sandpile? In what does the identity of the sandpile consist? Here's one way of thinking about it. It's really a question of continuity of substance. Suppose in the intervening 24 hours some kids have come and they've played in the sand. They've tracked some of it home in their shoes. Is it the same sandpile? Probably we say yes. It wasn't really very much sand that disappeared. What if a truck came and took some of the sand away, but left most of it there? We might say it's still the same sand pile. It's somewhat smaller today. But suppose that a truck came and took away all of that sand, and then another truck came and dumped different sand in its place. It might be even the same shape as the old pile, the same size as the old pile. Nevertheless, we want to say it's a different pile of sand. So in this case, where we're concerned with just quantities of matter, Locke says it's a matter of continuity of substance. Is it just more or less the same stuff that was there yesterday? Some of this stuff might be gone, some of it might be new, might be the wind blew some new sand in there, blew some of the old sand away. But as long as that's a continuous process and a gradual process, we end up saying it's the same pile of sand. It's the sudden change, the one truck taking all or almost all of it away and then another truck dumping all or almost all of it on, that leads us to say it's a different pile of sand. What about a mechanical object? Something like an automobile. Is it really just a question of more or less the same stuff? Probably not. After all, I might get new tires on my car, but it's still the same car. I might replace the top on my convertible, but it's still the same convertible. I might replace the carburetor. I might replace all sorts of things in the car, and yet we say it's the same automobile. And so it's not really just a question of continuity of substance, having the same stuff there. What does constitute the sameness of a machine? Well, think about a simpler machine, something like a guitar. I can restring the guitar, and it's still the same guitar. Can I replace the neck and have it still be the same guitar? Probably. Can I replace the body and call it the same guitar? Now I'm not so sure. So we want to say it's not just a question of continuity of substance. Some of the parts seem to matter a lot more than other parts. What we can say is that it's a matter of continuity of structure. If I gradually, over time, replace the strings, replace the neck of the guitar, even replace the body, let's say if it's damaged or cracked, we'd say, well, it's still the same guitar. And the same thing with the car. I might gradually replace the parts, but we'd say it's still the same car, even if now it has new tires, now a new top, and so on. The structure is the same. If I radically reconfigured it, on the other hand, we might say, that's a different guitar. That's a different car. Now, what about animal? What makes something the same bird or the same cat? It's not really just a question of continuity of substance, the same stuff. After all, we're constantly taking in food and excreting things, and as a result, the actual composition of our bodies changes. Moreover, it's not really a question of the same structure. I might lose an arm, but still be me. I could lose my legs, but still be me. And the same thing with a cat. The cat could be injured, lose a leg, and so on, still the same cat. So what makes something the same animal? Locke says it's a question of bodily continuity. I might indeed lose an arm, and it might be reconfigured with a sort of bionic arm or some other kind of thing that leaves me rather different from a certain point of view, a structural point of view. But nevertheless, you could say there's a kind of continuity to my body. Now, if you replaced all my parts at once, presumably I wouldn't be the same animal. But if I, at some point, get a transplant of this or that, if I have my hand replaced with an electronic sort of mechanical hand and so on, all of these things are compatible with my being the same animal. But now, what about being the same person? Dan Bonavac, of course, is not just a lump of matter, not just a machine of a certain kind, not just an animal of a certain kind, in fact. I am a person. What does that mean? Locke says being the same person is not the same as just being the same animal. Why? Well, because person has moral significance. Person is something that grants me rights. I have a certain legal status, I have a certain moral status as a result of being a person. Moreover, I have responsibilities. I have rights, I have responsibilities. You can talk about what I ought to do, what I must do. All of those things are unique to me as a person. They don't apply to lots of other animals. They don't apply to machines. They don't apply to just lumps of sand and other kinds of matter. And so there's something special about being a person. Now, what does make me the same person across time? Is it just a question of something about my body? Aristotle would say yes. In fact, the soul, he says, is really just the form of the body. So it's something like the body having the same form. Now, not, of course, exactly the same form. The form physically of a child is different from the form of an adult. Nevertheless, it's a matter of my body retaining a certain kind of structure, a certain set of essential properties. And if my body retains those essential properties, I am the same person. Of course, that's basically the same criterion as my being the same human being. So Aristotle would say, for me to be the same person and the same human being, they just come to the same thing. But Locke says that's not true. What is it that makes me the person I am? It's my thinking. I am a thing that thinks, as Descartes said. I'm essentially a thing that thinks. And so it's something about thought that actually defines the person I am. What I'm looking for here is not a continuity of matter, not a continuity of structure, not even a continuity of my body. It's a question of continuity of thought. Now, what is it for thoughts to be continuous? Well, he says, my consciousness has to be continuous. It has to be tied together in certain ways. Now, he doesn't mean I can never fall asleep, I can never lose consciousness, etc. That would be silly. I don't wake up a different person every morning. But what is the case is that my states of consciousness are tied together. Today, I remember what I was doing yesterday. Yesterday, I was thinking about what I would do today. My states of consciousness are linked together by planning, by anticipation, by hope, by memory, by all sorts of things. Regret, for example, hope, dreams, all sorts of things connect various mental states together. And so you could think of my fabric of consciousness is a fabric woven with all sorts of strands that are linked together across time. There are references to future states and to prior states within my stream of consciousness. Now that gives me a kind of identity, an identity that doesn't depend on anything actually about my body. As soon as he realizes that, Locke says, now that's quite striking, and there's some puzzles, you might think, that arise from this view, but he embraces them. He thinks, actually, this gives us the right kind of answer. For example, could Socrates be reincarnated as Caesar Borgia? Could, in general, one person be reincarnated as another? Locke says, in principle, yes. There's nothing to prohibit that. If we tie my identity to the body, it looks as if we've got a different body, then a different person. But Locke says it's actually a question of consciousness, a question of, if you want to think of it this way, the soul of myself as a thinking thing that establishes my identity. That isn't essentially tied to my body. So could the same thoughts be in a different body? Yes. And that would mean that that person could be reincarnated in another body. Now, of course, if they remember nothing of their prior life, then you might say, well, they're not really reincarnated. There isn't any identity of consciousness. But after all, people can go through stages where they're forgetful. If I could be brought into a state where I would actually remember that, then Locke would be in principle thinking it could be possible that reincarnation could occur. Does that mean he believes in reincarnation? Not really. It's just that he thinks there's no conceptual confusion in it. It's quite a possible state of affairs. The same thing is true with a person being turned into an animal, for example. Heliogabalus is the example he gives, being turned into a hog. But it could also be a question of somebody being turned into a prince and awaiting the princess's kiss and all of that to turn back into a prince. That's possible. A wicked witch could do that, he says, as long as there's the continuity of thought, continuity of body, continuity of structure, continuity of matter. None of that is really essential. Could we have one person in two different bodies? In principle, yes, as long as the thoughts were continuous. It could be that I'm a mild-mannered college professor by day in Austin, Texas, and at night when I'm asleep here, maybe I lead a double life somewhere else. Maybe I'm a Chinese farmer. As long as there could be some continuity of consciousness between these two states, then we could actually have the same person occupying two different bodies. Even at the same time, there I've imagined that we sort of alternate by day and night, but actually what if I somehow were able to occupy two bodies and go back and forth between those perceptions and have one unified state of mind across those things and continuity of thought across those different bodies? Then he says that's a conceivable state of affairs. Could we have more than one person in one body? Well, yes. We could have two different streams of consciousness that don't intersect, that don't interact, even in the same body. There's no reason in principle why one person couldn't occupy two bodies, or two people couldn't occupy one body. Finally, the big question. Is life after death possible? Locke says yes. Now actually an Aristotelian can say yes too, by virtue of the resurrection of the body. The form of the body has to be reconstituted, but that in principle is possible. And so an Aristotelian can say, yes, it is possible for someone to survive death and have life after death. Locke says that's true even if we ignore considerations about the body, even if the body were not resurrected, or resurrected in a radically different form. None of that matters. What really matters is my identity as a thinking thing. And my thoughts are not, he says, essentially tied to my body. I can imagine myself without my body. So, I am essentially a thing that thinks. That means it is really my thought that defines me. Something like my physical death is not enough to actually lead to my destruction. Of course, it might be. He's not saying that this is an argument in favor of life after death. But he's saying there is no philosophical argument against it. It's possible. Whether it's the case or not, that's a different question. Just as the question of whether there are any wicked witches that turn people into frogs and back again, well, maybe there aren't. But there's nothing inconceivable about it. There's nothing impossible about it. And the same thing is true of life after death. Has he given us an argument that we do survive our own deaths? No. But he has said there's nothing contradictory in the idea. What matters is continuity of consciousness. And if my consciousness could exist without my body, that means it could exist even after my own physical death.